In any video game you have ever played, you have played as some sort of character. The character you control, or the protagonist, can range from a wide variety of things. A 7-foot-tall space marine, an Italian assassin from the 15th century, a goose, or a handful of pixels. No matter the game, you are controlling someone or something. In some games, the protagonist is much more memorable than in others. Some games really don't even focus much on the protagonist and more on the gameplay. But today, I'd like to talk about what separates a good protagonist from a bad one, and what separates a good protagonist from a great one. But before we start talking about who's good and bad, let's talk about the qualities a character can have that make them a good or bad character. Also, spoiler warnings for just a lot of games. Let's start with the good qualities a character can have. To make this easier for us to talk about, I've created this little chart for us to sort of rate a character's specific attributes. Let's start on the top. The first good quality a character can have is to be relatable or projectable. A relatable character is someone whose actions are similar to the actions that the player may make. A good example of this sort of character is Lee from Telltale's The Walking Dead game. In the first season, you play as Lee, who is generally a good man, but who snapped when he found his wife cheating on him and accidentally killed the man she was cheating on him with. As the game starts, and more specifically the zombie apocalypse starts, you are given a chance to redeem yourself as a man and as a good person. This character is completely relatable because you are essentially making all of his decisions. No, you didn't decide to kill a man before the game started, but it's understandable why he would want to hurt the guy his wife was banging, and as Lee says, it was an accident. He's not a bad guy, and neither are most of us, but now it's time to make some big decisions and we get to do it for him. An example of a projectable character is a character who the player can take control of and feel immersed in the game and in the character's role. It may be easy to project onto Lee, but hard to project onto Trevor Phillips. Trevor's personality is so larger than life and so out of control that it's nearly impossible to get into his shoes. He's rude, loud, and does unthinkable amounts of drugs. He may be a really interesting character, but he is most certainly not projectable. We'll talk about Trevor again a bit later, but hopefully you can see why I group relatable and projectable into the same category. The next corner of what I am now going to refer to as the DPC, or Dumpy's Protagonist chart, is personality/engagement. A huge part of what makes a game engaging is if the characters themselves are engaging. A part of why a game like Animal Crossing is so much fun is because each character is unique and usually fun to talk to. Most characters have catchphrases, most characters have specific styles, and most characters have their own dreams and fears. It's fun to play Animal Crossing because loading into your town and chatting up with the folks that live there is actually really fun on its own. This category is fairly self-explanatory, so I won't harp on it anymore. The final corner of the DPC is development/motivation. A character only matters to us if the character has something that matters to them. Personally, I think one character with some of the best development and motivation is Kratos from God of War. If you don't know his story, basically he's tricked into murdering his own family by the god Ares, and sets off to exact revenge on the gods for ruining his life. I really don't want to spoil much because the story is a lot of fun to learn about on your own, and my summarized version isn't going to do it any justice. But in God of War, you have a clear goal and obvious motivation for your actions. You, Kratos, are going to get revenge, and you, the player, are going to help him do it. You really become entwined with a character like this because Kratos hits all three categories hard. You can project onto him, not because we murder gods on the daily, but because I'm sure you'd want revenge too. He's also incredibly engaging, as learning about his story and more about his personality as the games go on is the most fun part for me personally. And like we talked about, Kratos has more than enough motivation for his actions, so personally I think all of these factors combined set Kratos at the absolute highest tier a protagonist of any sort can achieve. Now we talked about what makes a character good, but now let's talk about what can really bring down a character. The bad qualities, aka the Dump's Stinky Stinker chart, aka again, the DSSC. The bad qualities are easily explained. They are just the good qualities, but the opposite. So instead of relatability/projectability, you have disdain and distance. Instead of personality/engagement, you have boring/stale. And instead of development/motivation, you are left with confusion and detachment. This doesn't really need to be its own separate chart. Honestly, I just wanted to say Dump Stinky Stinker chart. But if you see a character with a DPC chart like this, then it may be clear that the character exhibits some of these negative qualities. So now that we know what makes a character good or bad, let's talk about some characters that I think are good or bad. So because we started with the good qualities, let's start with the bad characters. I think a character that is widely agreed upon to be an objectively bad protagonist is Spartan Locke from Halo 5. Locke isn't the only protagonist in Halo 5, as we do get to play as Master Chief later, but Locke is the character we start with. So what makes Locke a bad character? Well, as I'm sure lots of you know, Halo's lore is deep and very complicated, and Locke is really no different. He has his reasons to hate the UNSC and to hate Chief specifically, but the game doesn't explore these motivations nearly enough. So what we're left with in Halo 5 is a new protagonist who hates our old, obviously favored protagonist. In Halo 5, Locke is not relatable at all, as we really don't know shit about him. He doesn't make up for any of that lack of relatability with personality either, as we haven't known him for long and his first impression most people get from him is he's just a hard-ass bounty hunter type, and that's just not interesting enough. We're finally left with motivations that are just, again, not explained well enough in the game, and unfortunately Spartan Locke, and Halo 5 as a whole really, is just this awkward, confusing mess. Another different kind of mess is The Last of Us 2. I know it's been talked about to death, and I won't talk about it for too long, but it's just weird. In The Last of Us 2, you play as Ellie from the first game, and a girl named Abby. At the start of the game, Abby kills Joel because Joel killed Abby's dad. Then a lot of other shit happens, and we end up playing the game from Abby's perspective. This creates this insane rift between the protagonist, in this case Abby, and the player. Abby just fucking murdered the character we spent the whole first game as, and now we're expected to be her? NakeyJakey does a fantastic job explaining this in his video talking about the game and explaining what ludonarrative dissonance is. It's a fantastic video, so I'll link it in the description or on screen or whatever, I'll figure it out later. But the point is, Abby is outright unlikable from the get-go, and Ellie herself becomes this truly confusing character whose words do not reflect her actions at all. I know lots of people like The Last of Us 2, and I'm really happy for you, but I think the protagonists, or I guess the protagonists, are a bit questionable at least. On the subject of questionable, let's talk about a man I mentioned earlier, Trevor Phillips. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Trevor is a bad character because I wouldn't mean it and it would be wrong. But as a protagonist, Trevor raises some interesting concerns. With our criteria, how well does he fit into the DCP? Well, I'd say something like this. As you can see, Trevor scores really highly in the personality department, as his personality is, hard to forget. But that's part of the problem. If you don't like his personality and his crazy ways, then you're probably not going to like him at all. That's because, like I said earlier, he's almost impossible to project onto, and his motivations seem to be ever-changing, or at least they're buried under his borderline insanity. He's incredibly engaging. I mean, most of us can't wait to see what he's going to do next, but if you don't like a character who relies heavily on that sort of thing, then you really are not going to like Trevor. In summary for Trevor, he's a great character, no debate that he's fascinating, but he's a questionable protagonist because we need someone we can relate with and understand, not just be entertained by. The last bad protagonist I want to talk about is Corvo Attano. Corvo is the main character of the first Dishonored game and one of the selectable main protagonists of the second game. Now, most people are probably throwing their hands up in confusion right now, wondering why I would say Corvo is a bad character, because I'm sure if you've only played the first Dishonored, you'd think he's great. The silent but deadly assassin granted powers by the Outsiders that he can destroy the people who betrayed him. It's a cool story, and Dishonored is one of my favorite games of all time, but when I played Dishonored 2, I was floored.
Every year, I think the anniversary of Jessamine's death will be easier, but it never is.
They made Corvo talk. Yeah, I'm serious. Corvo saying even a single fucking word absolutely ruined this character for me. Especially because it's the same guy that plays Mercer Frey, and I hate that guy. Corvo was perfectly projectable because he didn't have much personality. You could be a reckless killer or a quiet, careful vulture waiting for the right moments to strike. But all of a sudden in Dishonored 2, he can talk and he has his own personality, and anything I made up in my head, and yes, I made up plenty, is tossed to the fucking curb. My own headcanons, my own projected personality no longer matter, and that was so sad to me. I understand that I'm pretty much just ranting at this point, but come on. Mercer Frey? Anyway, someone please sympathize with me in the comments. I know I said Corvo would be the last bad protagonist I talk about, but I'd like to mention a different sort of bad protagonist, the forgettable protagonist. I could not tell you the name of the guy from Dying Light. No idea. And I just played it not that long ago, but Dying Light did an awful job of making me like, whatever his name is, because all I remember is that he has the same voice actor as Mirage from Apex or Sonic from Sonic Boom, and that's all I can hear when he talks. He's like just the least unique character of all time. Also, the characters from Dead Island are also just noteworthily unnoteworthy, and I only remember Sam B's name because, well,
Sam B got the thing that go bump in the night. Whoa.
bitch, and I'm gonna... Anyways, now I've complained for long enough. Let's start giving some characters some praise, because I really do think that there are more good protagonists, or at least likable ones, than there are bad protagonists. There's so many good ones, in fact, that I'm gonna break it down into sections, starting with the quiet type. The quiet type of character is real simple. They don't talk much, and they're easy for the player to project onto and feel immersed in. Some examples of this type of character are Samus from the Metroid games, who talks very minimally, and Doom Guy from the Doom games, who just rips and tears. These two characters are undebatably badass characters, and that's kind of like the point of these sorts of protagonists. Make the player feel immersed and powerful, and you've got them hooked. I would put Corvo from Dishonored 1 here in a heartbeat, but fuck Corvo from Dishonored 2, and fuck Bethesda for making me feel like this. Anyways, another character that sort of fits into this type is Master Chief. Chief talks a healthy amount through the Halo franchise, but he talks just enough to where you can relate and project still, while still wanting to hear him talk more. I remember how every time a cutscene came on in Halo 3, I would just crank the volume on my TV so that in case he talked, I would get to hear his voice loud and clear. These characters are easy for everyone to like, as their personalities don't get in the way of their projectability, but they can often lack a sense of motivation, as their goals are not always clear. The next type of protagonist is what I call the blank slate. This is another simple type of character, as the blank slate is essentially any RPG character. Examples of this type are the Dragonborn from the Protagonist Skyrim, your character in Monster Hunter World, or any WoW character you can think of. This type of character usually maxes out the relatability / projectability quality because they are you. You make them, you control them, and you speak for them. It's not always as clear and immersive as we might like it to be, but these characters are fun because you can be who you want to be. Next on the list of good protagonist types is the story-focused character. The story-focused character is the category where you will find the best of the best as far as protagonists go. Kratos, Arthur Morgan, Nathan Drake, Joel, and Lee are all great examples of this type. These characters are often the most memorable, as the gameplay isn't usually the sole focus of their games. If you played Uncharted without paying attention to the story, you'd probably think the game is subpar. If you played Red Dead 2 without enjoying the world building happening around you, you'd probably get bored. But when you find a game with a story that can keep you engaged the way these games and these characters do, they will most often be your favorite. The final type of good protagonist is sort of a big toy bin of subcategories that I call the gameplay-focused characters. The gameplay-focused characters are protagonists from games where the main character may not have much personality or development, but similar to the quiet type, they're often easy to project onto. Notable subcategories include, but are not limited to, platformers, where Mario and Sonic are immortalized in gaming history. Shooters, where Apex Legends and Overwatch characters may have good background development, but it doesn't really matter in the actual gameplay. Survival game characters, who often have some sort of secondary goal, like the guy from the forest who wants to rescue his son, or in Minecraft, where you technically beat the game when you kill the Ender Dragon. Sports game characters from games like NBA 2K or the Madden games, which are often high in engagement because the audiences already know the characters in the games. Fighting game characters such as Ryu from Street Fighter, who has an actual background, but similar to the shooter game characters, it doesn't really matter when you're just beating the shit out of each other. Indie game characters, which I'm not even going to begin to get into. Simulation games, which are projectable? I don't know, man. You play fucking Lawnmower Simulator and you tell me how much you projected onto that character. And a handful of other games that are really hard to classify on their own, such as Flash games, old Atari-type games, arcade-like games, I guess like rhythm games. So as I'm sure you can tell by now, there are no shortage of different types of protagonists when it comes to video games. But there's one specific character I'd like to touch on, who I think truly encapsulates every definition of a good protagonist, and that's John Marston. If you've never played Red Dead Redemption or its prequel, sequel, whatever, Red Dead Redemption 2, then you are doing yourself an incredible disservice. If you haven't played either games, I implore you to throw this video in your watch later playlist and play both games. I cannot stress enough how amazing the stories in these two games really are. Really, it's only one big story though, the story of John Marston and the end of outlaws in America. Red Dead 2 takes place before Red Dead 1, and throughout most of Red Dead 2, you play as a man named Arthur Morgan. When I first started playing this game, I was ecstatic to see John Marston, as I knew he was in the game. I could not have cared less about Arthur, but as the game went on, I grew to love his character, as he starts to become a better man and understand that the world around him is falling apart. John and Arthur were part of the same gang for years, but one day John up and left the gang, off to start his new life away from his wife and his young son. He came back eventually, but Arthur greatly disapproved of John's decision to leave the group, and it's obvious when they interact. I won't dive too deep into the story because it is long, but essentially John and Arthur come to terms as they realize the gang around them is starting to unravel, and the man who's been leading them is really no better than the men they've killed themselves. Arthur and John try to escape the group after the infighting boils over, but Arthur doesn't make it. He does, however, ensure that John escapes with his life and is able to return to his family. This is where John's real journey begins. John has committed countless sins as a cowboy, just like Arthur. They're both bad men who have done bad things, but done them with their best intentions. So at the end of Arthur's storyline, we get to play as John. In the epilogue, we essentially set Marston up for the events of Red Dead 1. We build a little farm, we make amends with our wife and son, and all seems well. But obviously if you've played Red Dead 1, you know that not all is well. Like I said, Marston has done innumerable bad things as a cowboy, but now he has finally settled down and gone straight in life. Unfortunately for him, his past catches up to him and Marston is marked as a threat by the law as they begin to try and civilize the country. Times are beginning to change and gone are the days of cowboys and outlaws. Marston is forced to help the lawmen as they've taken his wife and son into custody until he is able to hunt down the members of his old gang, your gang, in Red Dead 2. As you play through the first game, you see new, really they're old, faces and kill several of them. Like I said, the government sees your past gang as a threat and wants them gone. In the end, however, you are the last piece of the puzzle, the last loose end. Bill, Micah, Javier, Karen, I like Karen, Arthur, and Dutch are now all dead, and it's time for the great John Marston to be the last nail in the coffin for the Wild Wild West. The law comes down on John and he isn't able to survive. The story may sound nice and all, but why do I think it's the best story a video game has ever told? Because not with just one, but two separate protagonists, Red Dead Redemption managed to fill out the DPC for me. Arthur Morgan is a grumpy old cowboy on the surface, but a deeper man full of regret and turmoil on the inside, who eventually dies saving a man he once resented. The man he saves, John Marston, is forced to pay for both of their sins by cleaning up the rest of the old gang. In the end, it's not the story of either man specifically. It's the story of both men together, bound by their vices and both left dead at the end with truly no redemption. Or who knows, maybe I just made all that up and it's just a gunslinging cowboy game. Either way, both Arthur and John made a lasting impact on me, and I cannot recommend that you play these games enough, as I know that I did not do the story justice. Thank you all for watching. I've been thinking about this video for a long time and it felt good to finally get it out of my brain. There's so many more great characters that I didn't get to talk about, so if you don't see them here, then comment them below. I'm sure I missed someone. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and sub and all that nonsense, and thanks again for watching everyone. GG's everybody.